second, I'd like to try to frame the conversation with a stat. I think it's one we've all heard more than once over the last few years, but it gives some context to the discussion. And I believe it's about 4 years old now, but I think it's relevant. So ships are responsible for the transport of 90% of global trade and account for about 3% of greenhouse gas emissions. When I first hear that, that 3% sounds not too bad. But from a climate impact standpoint, it's big. At the time, that would have placed shipping between Germany and Japan as the 6th largest contributor of CO2 emissions. So I realize that's open to claims of lies, damn lies, stats, shipping's not a country, depending on how you frame an industry, we can all talk about that. But I think it shows the level of positive impact that small changes in shipping can have on the global greenhouse gas emissions. That said, we all know current technology isn't there, doesn't get it done, so there's the challenge. And unlike maybe 2 years ago, I think it's clear we're not ignoring the elephant in the room any longer. So, one last stat. In February of 2021, we, Watson Farley, published a thought leadership report that we titled The Sustainability Imperative. We asked 545 leaders across our industry to weigh in on some issues. And one of those questions was, what are the biggest challenges for the maritime industry in the next 5 years? Majority of respondents, vast majority, pointed to reducing carbon emissions, carbon footprint. That was 24% of financiers, 29% of shipowners. So it's clearly an imperative. There's no getting around this. This is happening. There's no one segment that's going to solve this problem. We've accepted that. So we'll start from the top down, and I'm going to be general here, and maybe we'll start the conversation there. Starting with Richard. Which sectors of the industry need to be the main drivers of this change, the main agents of this change?
Okay, I think it's a very good question. And if you look at main drivers, the decarbonization for the shipping are mainly driven by 3 fundamentals. And the first one is definitely the regulators and the policy makers. And then the second one will be the access to the capitals. And the third one will be the cargo owners and the consumer expectations. And I think all those are driving the decarbonization. But which one will be the main driver will be very much dependent on which sectors we are in. And we all know that the IMO are putting requirements, and then next year there's a couple of the new regulations kicking by the CI and EXI, and as well as the SEM3. Those are putting the requirement for the ship design and operation requirements. And the EU are already decided to implementing the carbon trading system, and also the well-to-wake emission for the marine fuel. And what we also know that the IMO may adjusting the ambitions next year and implementing possibly the same thing. So the regulators are accelerating the requirements. And at the same time, as we heard from early discussion on access to the capitals, there's a more higher bar for getting the capitals. So you have a Poseidon principle, you have a sort of scientific goal index approach, and then you also understand that the insurance are joining the Poseidon principles. And we also know the net zero coalition from the banks are putting requirements already in 2030. And so those are driving the decarbonization. And again, on the cargo owners and the consumers, we all know that there's a requirement as here in the US that if you are stock list companies, you have to report directly and indirectly carbon emissions. And you will have consumers, brands like IKEA, Nike, and all those players. They are a requirement for including the value chain as part of the carbon requirements. So all those are putting the pressure. But again, I think individual segments are affecting one way or another. So it will be very interesting to see the rest of the panels, and what's your takeaway from that?
Moving down, Charis. Main drivers these days, where do you see them from your perspective? Is it the regulators, as Richard suggested?
So thank you, John, and good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here today. So to answer your question, John, and building up on what Richard said, I think it's very important that we break the whole decarbonization challenge into two phases. Because first, we have the short and medium term targets whereby as an industry we need to improve the energy efficiency of the existing fleet. And in that phase, the burden of pulling this off is mostly on the shoulders of the ship owners, who are the ones that have to look out for solutions, whether we're talking about technical or operational measures in the industry, in order to pilot, assess, research, and ultimately implement these solutions. For example, energy-saving devices, advanced technologies when it comes to hull coating, hull cleaning, voyage optimization platforms. All these solutions exist at the moment. We see advancements every day, and it's important for the ship owners to work with marine technology companies in order to find the right solutions and continuously improve the carbon intensity of the existing fleet. So this is the first phase. And the drivers there, the sectors, John, are mostly the ship owners and the marine technology companies. But looking further when it comes to the medium term and the longer term solutions, of course, there are a lot of developments when it comes to carbon capture, to onboard carbon capture, and this could be a game changer, especially if in the coming years we're able to find solutions that are able to capture on board the carbon to a large percentage and in a practical, cost-efficient and safe way. But we have to look even longer term than that, towards 2050, whether the ambition is there to reduce emissions by 50% or to go completely net zero. And there are voices in the industry right now that are advocating that we do go to net zero. We will absolutely need to see zero emission fuels coming into the picture. And there, of course, it is not only the ship owners or the technology companies that will have to take on that burden. First, we need to have the engines and the vessels available that will be able to burn green fuels. So there we have engine manufacturers and shipyards coming into play. Even if you have the vessel and the engine, you still need to have the fuel. So we need fuel producers, but also governments and financiers to come into the picture to make the necessary investments in order for us to have availability and the necessary infrastructure for the green fuels. And safety comes first. We all know that we need to have safety specifications, in which case one more sector is the classification societies, but also regulators that need to set the standards for these fuels. And last but not least, we have to look into the cost. Because for as long as the cost difference between conventional fuels and green fuels is exuberant, we cannot be able to implement changes when it comes to green fuels, which is where governments again come into play in order to be able to implement mechanisms that will be able to bridge the competitiveness gap between conventional fuels and green fuels. And in that respect, it's also the whole value chain that will need to collaborate in order to put into place agreements that will be in a position to pass on the additional cost down to the end consumer. So in a nutshell, if we're going to look at the longer term, John, it is a number of players across the industry that will need to play the part in order for us to be able to reach the long-term ambition that we have set for the industry. Thank you.
Sam, same question. Who are the main drivers? And building on what we've just said, does that change? Is that different today, and do you foresee a shift?
So good morning, everybody. I think if you took notes on what Charis just said, that's all you need to know. That pretty much covered everything that I think anybody needs to know. I'll turn the question a little bit. I'm the CEO of Overseas Shipholding Group. We operate in the United States, principally in the Jones Act trade, and to focus a little bit on what Charis has said in terms of how that affects things in the United States and what we might expect in the United States. And the theme that I would focus on and answer your question, John, is your opening remarks about small changes can make a big difference. And I think ship owners understand, or at least those that have thought about this deeply, that long-term moonshot solutions of transforming the existing installed marine asset base, those are worthy conversations and need to be thought about. But in the real terms, in order to make a difference, we have to focus on the installed base. This is particularly true in the Jones Act because the construction cost for a new vessel is exorbitant, and particularly when you think about long life assets. If you're building a ship today in the United States, the earliest delivery you're likely to get is 2027. The technology is not established as to what the propulsive system should be, what the fuel systems might be, and then you have to think about the fact that if you take a ship and ordered it today and you've got delivery in 2027, 28, that has a 30-year life. And so what are the implications of the decisions that you make today on a 30-year life where, 30 years from now, it could well be, we're in the tanker business, it could well be that the demand for fuel transportation coastwise in the United States is radically reduced, and you face obsolescence risk or stranded asset risks that, given the size of the investment for a Jones Act ship, are considerable. So to me, the real drivers in trying to figure out the incremental changes that Charis has referred to, how do you optimize the fuel efficiency on board your vessels? How do you work with the charters to optimize the efficiency of voyages? And ultimately, I think that comes to a need for charterers and owners, both in the United States as well as globally, to sit down and recognize that this is an our problem, not just an owner's problem. That particularly if you understand the way that the CII works, the charters are responsible for the voyage instructions, the speed, the distance, the intensity of the use of that vessel, and the owners follow charter's instructions. The CII grade is worn by the owners at the end of the day, and that's a point of conflict that needs to be resolved. And I think that one of the principal development points in the future for making progress in this area is getting owners and charters to sit down and recognize that change will only come if both parties focus on making or altering ways that things have been done historically to reflect the desire to really make those incremental changes. So,
what I'm hearing, it's interesting to hear your various perspectives from different owner perspectives. Scott, where do you come from? Is it a two-phased approach as we're hearing, or is there a transition? Does it depend on, is it very asset specific?
Well, yeah, I mean, certainly it's a transition. My first statement on this, which I said publicly before, this is a global energy issue. This isn't a shipping industry issue. And I think this gets lost a bit along the way. Everyone is expecting the ship owners and the shipping industry to come with the solutions. And, whether you agree or not, I argue that the shipping industry is pretty compliance culture. If you look at IMO 2020, where there's all these threats of non-compliance, if you look at any of the major regulatory regimes, I think the shipping industry always complied. But now we're being asked to kind of choose the lottery winner of the future technology. And we get a lot of ambitious statements, particularly from the politicians who are expecting more and more from us. I think that's good motivation, good to drive us. I think we can all agree. We're not climate deniers anymore. We accept the challenge. But when I hear politicians and leaders in the EU say, the technology is available, it's ready, there are things you can do now, and then they back that up because they've had a lot of vendors, suppliers, and entrepreneurs come and visit them and share their technologies. Well, they're coming to us as well, but what you're finding is these ideas, as interesting as they are, they're undercapitalized, they're not proven to be fit for service, and we as an industry are struggling between ambition, which is a great motivator, and practical, real solutions. We cannot order an ammonia-powered ship today. Methanol, we can start to see specifications that are available, so we can look into that. But if we go back only 15 years ago, LNG was the fuel of the future. And the problem is the science keeps evolving. So we're having trouble relying on the science. And what are we measuring? You're first told to measure tank to weight, just that portion that the ship consumes. But really, this is an absolute emission issue. So I think the issue is a lot more dynamic, a lot more complex. And getting to the heart of your question, whose responsibility is it? I agree exactly what Sam just said. You know, this is the first regulation where when we meet with charterers and cargo interests, they're not asking us, how are you going to deal with this? They're asking, how are we going to deal with this? So it's a global interest, it's a global energy issue, it's not a shipping issue.
And Soren, being CEO of a database platform that leverages that info, is there a particular segment, or is it a change in sort of paradigm and approach?
Yeah. First of all, thank you so much for inviting us. And being a software company, looking across, of course, looking a little bit from the outside in on this, and understanding the perspective both from the ship owner and the charter. I really think that this is where Sam is also hitting it right, is saying is the alignment across the value chain. I don't think it's a segment. I actually think it is more looking at the different users across the value chain that have to solve this together. And one of the challenges that the industry is really having is a trust between each other, right? So how many charters are not being still fixed on warranted speeds, and then the vessels are selling the warranted speeds but not being optimized. And then we spend a lot of money on claiming each other and debating what was the weather and so on, right? So if we actually had more transparency and we actually work together in a trusted way, I think there's like easily 15-20% that can be optimized on that. And we've seen that across the value chain in many, many use cases. And then you say that the future fuels is a second phase. But if you actually optimize now, that will, in my mind, that will actually be the one that can finance that future. If we don't optimize, we don't take that value out of the supply chain, I think it will be very difficult for us to actually fund that future growth and that future energy consumption. Because the fuels will be much more expensive, right? And as Scott rightfully is saying, we will be short on this, right? So it's going to be very, very imperative for all of us that we across the value chain align incentives and build trust between the different stakeholders and find that common goal. The good side of this, of course, is that anytime you save, and it sounds a little bit easy said, but difficult to do, but every time you save a ton of fuel, of course, we make more money, right? And I think that's the whole notion, and there's just a lot of money on saving. Let's say 10, 15, 20% is a lot, but it's there. And it's really about getting stakeholders aligned from just in port time arrival, so we don't sell too fast to drop anchor. It's still being done so much across the value chain. It's about not claiming each other and actually optimizing for the same and build that trust. It's about empowering those people that is taking the commercial decisions. So I'm a firm believer that this is not a technical issue only. Right, short term, this is a commercial issue, and we need to empower the commercial side of the business and have that aligned. And I think the transition is really happening around that now.
Interesting. So, Richard, building on your point where you highlighted that the regulators have an immense responsibility right now, and then, also taking in Sam's point, which I wrote, this is an our problem. I'm going to be stealing that one, Sam. It's good. How should the ship owners be engaged in the process now? What should ship owners be doing with regulators? It can't simply be a matter of regulators driving down and sort of developing policy without a dialogue. What can the ship owners be doing today to help shape those regulations?
That's a very good question, actually. If you see that from the regulator side, I think the regulation for emission control are accelerating, and we see that new regulations are coming into force, and both from the EU side and from the IMO side. And IMO next year is going to adjust the emission for even more tighter regulations. And I think from the owner side, what we actually did a study from DNV to look at the 2050, the fuel mixture, considering the trajectory for decarbonization. And what we found out is actually the technology is not an issue. I agree with you. And the major problem is the availability for carbon neutral fuel. And I also endorse what you mentioned, that this is actually an energy issues. So how to solve that problem? I think that whole industry need to work together to solve that problem, because this is not a shipping problem.
one interesting trend we've seen is certain owners have taken it upon themselves to set their own goals that are maybe a little more aggressive than the regulations that they're facing, which is interesting. So then we have some perspectives from owners here. Charis, do you think ship owners will become more and more proactive in setting these regulations and setting standards in the medium and near term?
Thank you, John. So I would say that the industry has learned the hard way that we need to have a strong voice when it comes to drafting of environmental regulations. In the past, we have been faced with cases where there was a lot of debate with regards to whether the regulations are designed in such a way that they can be practical, they can be viable for the industry, they can ensure a level playing field. So definitely the industry is becoming more vocal. We expect that the industry will continue to become more vocal, especially as environmental regulations are having more impact on the financials of a shipping company, on its business, on its strategies. And now how can this happen? Of course, it's ship owner alone. There's not much that we can do by ourselves. But there are the national shipping associations that can open a dialogue with the national delegations that are being represented at the IMO. The IMO is a global regulator. It sets the standards, it sets the targets, it sets the ambition. So through our national delegations and through other shipping organizations like the ISS, for example, ship owners can contribute, can give feedback, can give views, technical expertise in order to make sure that any new regulation is designed in a practical way, in a way that ensures the viability, the financial sustainability of our sector and does not cause disruptions when it comes to competition. Now, we are seeing also a lot of cooperation. Nowadays, we are seeing alliances being formed. We are seeing partnerships. John, you mentioned about ambition. For example, last year we saw the call to action for shipping decarbonization, where a number of shipping companies and other stakeholders of the industry made the call to action for the IMO and the government to increase the ambition of 2050 from 50% to net zero. So we do see the industry stepping up in terms of ambition, while in the past we were seeing the industry being more defensive and more critical when it comes to regulations. This is the first time that we're seeing the industry actually call for an increase in the ambition. So yes, the industry is being more vocal. We expect it to be more vocal, and that's something good for us because we'll make sure that the regulations are designed in an efficient way that will not only benefit the environment, but will also ensure that we continue doing our business in a profitable way. Thank you.
Sam, building on that, those coalitions and that proactivity that we're seeing, which is unprecedented for the most part among owners, you mentioned the getting to zero. What role does that play in the industry now in focusing efforts and driving efforts? Is it a proactive or reactive approach that's critical right now?
I think that, again, Charis is very well articulated changes that we've seen in the industry in the United States. OSG was a founding member of an organization called the Blue Sky Maritime Coalition. This is a group of people, industry people that spread across the inland waterways, the coastal trading, shipyards, ports, and the sort of the head of the Blue Sky Maritime Coalition, Carrie Troth, is actually speaking today at lunch, I think, so you'll get a chance to ask her some questions, I believe. But the central focus of that group is to look at the holistic solution. It's not just about ship owners. You have to look at how the port infrastructure is set up, what can be done. Soren has mentioned, the disconnect between charter party terms that incentivize an owner on a voyage charter to go as fast as possible to get to the port, because demurrage doesn't start until you, lay time doesn't start until you actually tender NOR. All of the financial incentives behind that ignore the port congestion issues, they ignore other issues that may result in, if you try to optimize that voyage, you try and do things differently. I think organizations like the Blue Sky Maritime Organization, Net Zero, will have a progressively larger role in voicing the opinions of the industry. I also think it's important to recognize that the IMO and organizations like that are fundamentally political organizations, and the politics behind many of the decisions that are taken in those organizations are aspirationally driven, agenda driven by political interests in the member states that come there. Obviously, we have to deal with those issues, but my own belief is the market is a much better arbiter of solutions, and that active engagement in organizations like the Blue Sky Maritime Organization brings the various constituents together in a neutral forum to be able to try and at least discuss possible solutions and problems. I personally believe organizations like that are going to be more effective in driving change over time than the larger politically oriented organizations.
Scott, your view, do you think owners are going to continue to be proactive as they have been, and that's a sort of critical path, as Sam said, that the markets are a better finder of solutions than the bodies sort of dictating?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely agree the market is a better and stronger force. I think when ship owners take leadership, it's not always well received. I just look at more recent IMO discussions where the International Chamber of Shipping tried to put forward basically a ship owner charter funded research and development fund. And it met nothing but criticism and I think intentional misdirection, particularly by EU politicians, who were misrepresenting what it was about. And, here ship owners were really in earnest from around the world trying to put together some money for research and development and not looking for handouts. So, this whole idea that the regulated should be the leaders of the regulations, it doesn't always fare so well. It's not well received, and I think we can agree that the incentives maybe aren't always pure, or the conflicts exist. So definitely align myself with the idea that the market is going to work much stronger. We talked about this being a shared responsibility, and this is what we're doing with our charters and the cargo interests that we work with is, what are their objectives, and how can we develop solutions that meet their objectives? But the regulations will come. We have to adhere to them. That's not a question. But what we're seeing is some of the regulations aren't making a lot of sense. Part of that's because the science hasn't really evolved. But just looking at this CII that comes into force next year, the metrics aren't fit for purpose. They're creating perverse incentives. And the regulators aren't listening to the ship owners. The Blue Sky Coalition has a brilliant paper on how there's a mismatch. And yet the IMO wants to wait for 3 more years to give it a try before they try to approve things. So.
That's an interesting point. What can be done now to help bridge that disconnect, if anything?
We have to work together, right? We have to understand, we have to have common objectives, we have to set aside political ambition, which is short-term by definition in my mind, and we have to agree to what it is we're trying to do. And if we're trying to reduce absolute emissions, then we have to focus on a metric that does that. But at the same time, we also have to put the ambition in check with reality. You said it at the beginning, 90% of the global trade, which demands shipping to be efficient as it can be, 2 to 3% of the emissions, okay, we can accept that they're going to increase in proportion. Global trade's going to increase in proportion, but we have to find a way. I don't know, I'm not so optimistic that we're going to have peace, love, harmony, and kumbaya, and we're all going to figure it out. I mean, that's not the way the world entirely works. But I think this time, owner and charter are going to work closer together, and they're going to find common ground and shared objectives, and that market force is going to drive improvement.
Soren, where do you see the influence coming? Does the industry need to be more proactive? Do platforms like yours need to be driving that data to the regulatory bodies and saying this is what's possible, this is where we are today?
So very much aligned, of course, what the rest of panelists saying. And then when we talk about that people across the value chain have to work together to solve it, right? I fully echo of the CI, but it's there and we have to work with it, right? So we have two approaches on the CI. We can begin to enhance our charter party of beating each other up. How do you re-deliver the vessel? Or you can begin to work together and say, how do we drive down the CI rating? I'm not saying it's a perfect metrics, but the metrics is there, right? So that's kind of the two angles. You can begin to regulate each other with legal clauses in the charter party, or you can work together. And I really think, and I have a super strong belief that we need to work together. The hampering for that is people's willingness to share data across the value chain. People are like, when we talk to our customers, which is across the value chain, and they want to share data with us, they're very concerned. Out of the 170 people we now are in ZeroNorth, right, we are 5 people in data security alone, because it's such a big topic of our customers, of how protective are we, how do we anonymize data, how do we aggregate data, because people are just not keen on sharing. And if you're not keen on sharing, then how do you build this win-win situation? And that's of course because we come from an industry that is not like used to trust each other across the value chain, right? We are used to like being counterparts, and I'm not naive in saying that can change overnight. So I think the words are rightfully so, but we need to find common grounds and find some way of trust each other so we can do that cross-optimization for us. And then also for the regulative side, of course there's a lot of different bodies around that is trying to drive the agenda for the shipping industry and a lot of support for that. But then I come back to the fact of saying, okay, how do we then open up and do case studies or share data around what has actually been good practice so that we learn from each other? And I think is a tough side as well, because it's a fragmented market and people are really protective of their business, which they should, it's their business. So how do you balance that of sharing good cases and sharing data across for all of us to learn? Because there's not one player across the value chain that's big enough to drive the change. There's not one player that have enough data to make that change. We can only do this and understand the complexity and the aggregated level if we collaborate and share data across.
Interesting.
John, maybe if I could, I just want to add to that. There's a terminology that's kind of bandied about, which I like, which is called radical transparency. And I think the world is different today than it has been even 10 or 15 years ago. The amount of real-time data that's available as to the performance of ships, whether the actual drivers that influence a voyage specifically or a service over time. I think the technology has made significant advances in really the last 5 or 7 years. Combining those two factors, the access to real-time accurate data, large data sets of sister ships where you can actually form a foundation as to what a ship's performance should be, and then the tracking through the AIS and through other means. I think that information is already available to anyone who wants to go and look at it, and therefore a commitment of the parties to actually embracing that radical transparency and working with that data to find solutions. I really think that's one of the drivers that will make a significant change.
But maybe and I fully echo that, right? But that data is sitting with the ship owner. It's very rarely shared with the charter. I've actually not seen any owner like willing to share sensor data in example to a charter. I actually have not seen that. Because it becomes an economical thing between them as well, right? So fully echo the data is there, but how do we trust each other to start sharing it?
Mindful of the time, but sort of in closing, and I don't want to use the word easy wins because there are none, but for the solutions, for the options, for the progress we're seeing today, where do you see the most opportunity for real progress in the short and medium term in our sites? Is it implementation of green corridors? Is it sort of development of a particular tech? We'll just go down the line.
Okay, thank you. And if we look at the decarbonization target, if we see that by 2050 that we have to achieve net zero carbon emissions for shipping, then I think, Michael, you have mentioned that 5% of the fuel has to be carbon neutral by 2030. And then we are talking about 270 million tons of fuel has to be transit to the carbon neutral. And the DME has done a study, and we look at what will be available carbon neutral fuel. Then we talk about the biofuel, and which will require a sustainable biomass. And we talk about the e-fuel, which require a sustainable renewable electricity. And we talk about the blue fuel, which will need carbon capture and storage. And all those require a significant investment, those on board of the vessel, and even higher on shore facilities. And this brings a tremendous challenge, but also opportunities. And there will be tremendous investment opportunities. But I think those require a collaboration between the industry and working together.
Where are we looking right now in the very medium, short term for our progress, our benchmark?
Thank you, John. So I'll focus on three things. First, energy efficiency. Let's make sure that we leverage all existing solutions and solutions that are being advancement right now in order to improve energy efficiency of the existing fleet and improve the carbon intensity, whether these are technical or operational measures. The solutions are there. As Soren mentioned, there are significant savings that can be achieved with existing solutions. Let's make sure that as an industry we take advantage of those. It's not only good for the environment, it's also good for our pockets because we're saving bunker consumption. Second, I would focus on carbon capture technology. There is humongous opportunity if we're able to advance this technology and to be in a position as an industry to capture carbon on board, provided we can do this in a safe and practical and cost-effective way. So we need to see advancements there, and as ship owners, if we can help with the R&D and with pilots, that would be great. And third, very important as well, we need to continue participating in the dialogue and the partnerships related to green fuels. There's a lot of work that needs to be done there. Along with Oldendorff and Rio Tinto and BHP, we have created a consortium to focus on a green corridor between Australia and East Asia. This is just a small piece of the puzzle. There are many other pieces that we need to develop in order to bring everything together and take it to the next step of introducing green fuels in the coming decade. So let us continue this partnership, these alliances, this dialogue, because as everyone else has mentioned, there needs to be collaboration and partnership across the value chain. Thank you.
So I'm just going to repeat what I said before, that the concept of radical transparency to me is something that owners, I think, should be willing to embrace. There's obviously a need from the other side to be able to understand what that means. I think that opens doors for ship owners to make investments in attaining better operational and technical efficiency in the existing installed asset base. That has to be done in a way where there's a monetization of the savings that is realized by the owner, not by the charter. Charter parties today exist. Any reduction below the warranted speed consumption, the benefit of that goes 100% to the charter. It doesn't create any incentive for the owner to do anything other than to meet the speed and consumption warranties. That's just a misaligned incentive structure. Change that structure so that you have radical transparency. So the actual fuel consumption, the actual speed, all of that is made readily available to the charters and the owners. There's no, obviously that opens some exposure to the owners, but if you do that and the owners have the right incentive, they go to the charters and tell them, look, I'm going to invest X $100,000 into an efficiency savings device. I need to recover that capital investment. If I'm going to do that, you're going to save, the ship is going to save money in fuel. Everybody wins. There's less carbon emissions if we have less fuel consumption. We're a Scope 3 provider to your services, and so you're going to counter our carbon in any case. Let's work on a structure like that. I think that starts to make some real differences. The trust issue that Soren raises is a very important one. But go back to the point that I said earlier, and Scott actually gave me the idea, so I'm going to give him the credit for it. That it's this is no longer a ship owner solely a ship owner problem. This is an our problem, or us together, and that trust issue has to be built. But I think there is progress in making changes that we'll hopefully see over time.
Just keep going on this one. So yeah, I think building on the theme that it's an us issue. I mean, there's an increased demand for reduced emissions. I don't think there's any question there, whether it's being driven by the finance sector, now the insurance sector, definitely public money, publicly traded companies have a lot of shareholder demand. So in dry bulk, at least with Oldendorff, our clients are increasingly request reduced emissions, which means there's an opportunity, right? So what do we want as shipowners? We want opportunity to develop more lucrative business, and it takes green to go green. So I build on that, right? And we are developing some solutions for our clients, but it means we have to come to a common understanding of what is it we're trying to achieve, and then we have to look at the broad supply chain. It doesn't make sense if we adjust the sea leg only to end up in a port where we swapped out barges for trucks. I mean, what have we accomplished? Nothing there. So there is opportunity. And then the other thing that I think we need to grab a hold of early on is we need to protect first movers. And the Green Corridor is a potential solution for that. There's some papers coming in the IMO that are going to work on that, perhaps market-based measures with some contributions. I think we have a lot to learn from LNG. We can't bet the world on LNG only 15 years later to find everyone who invested in LNG is now criticized by the World Bank and others for choosing the wrong fuel. So we have to keep that in mind, because most of these assets won't have achieved their useful economic life until long after the politicians of the day have left office.
Well, thank you, and thank you all for listening. Mindful of the blinking light, we could probably go on, but thanks to our hosts, and thank you.